So let's take a moment and talk about public education in the state of Texas. Oh man, Texas is a unique bird when it comes to education. Article 7, Section 1 of the Texas State Constitution, rewritten in 1876 after Reconstruction and Texas left the country, joined another country, and wanted to come back into the country. Part of that Constitution, in Article 7, it talks about Texas public schools. Now, if you went through a Texas public school as a child, like I did, then you would know that maybe at some point Texas had to fight for its freedom, being a part of Mexico during the days of the Alamo, way back in 1844, 1845. Texas won its independence and was actually its own country for about 9 years, until it went bankrupt and the United States wanted all that territory, and you know all that history. But one of the grievances that the native Texans at the time had with Mexico is they wanted public schools. And the early public schools in Texas were largely rural, community schools. Heck, if you know anything about the Masons, some public schoolhouses were actually located where Masons met back in those days. 2-story buildings, ransacked shacks, craziness when you think about early education in the state of Texas. But as the state evolves, changes, grows, gets back into America, there was an early interest and investment in education. But what makes Texas so unique is that the way the laws are written, we have these things called independent school districts. If you're new to Texas, that might seem a little weird. See, in some places, it's done by city, like California, for example, or some places it's done by county, like Florida. The counties run each school. So wherever county you live in, then the county draws the attendance boundaries based on where you live. So if you move to Texas, you might find it a little bit strange that you live in a town, let's say Keller, Texas, but you actually go to a whole different school district like Northwest or even Fort Worth. But yet your zip code and your town and where you pay your water bill or where your trash goes is actually a whole other town, city. It's a little strange. In fact, fun story, I worked in Irving ISD at a school called the Academy. It's now called the Jack Singley Academy, a CTE school. And it was told to me that because of where the school is, and it's the furthest north in that school district, that they actually had to redraw the attendance boundary lines for the parking lot of the school because where the land was actually purchased from another school district. How weird is that? But that's Texas. Over 1,024 independent school districts spread out from the largest to the smallest, from Houston ISD to Loving, I think, ISD. Tiny, tiny, tiny places. There's more small school districts than there are big ones. Then on top of those 1,024 public independent school districts across the state, there are also charter schools, public charter schools that are owned and operated by different organizations, and Lord knows where their board of regents are, or any of those things, and I won't get into that today. And private schools, home schools, and so on and so on. It should be noted that Texas actually has the most school choice of any state in the United States. So if you are a parent in the state of Texas and you want different educational opportunities for your child, you have lots of choices, from private to public to charter to homeschool. You can do whatever you want. So the push for more school choice seems a little odd, considering Texas already offers a vast array. But one thing Texas doesn't offer yet is public vouchers, where you can take the public money, tax money, and take that money and give it a parochial or a private school of your choice and get a different kind of education. Anything, Texas has always made an intentional investment in public schools for a long, long time. And there's always been a debate about where that money should come from. Texas is a very oil and gas-rich state, so there were proposals long ago in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even in the 70s to take those oil and gas revenues and put it right back into education. But as time has evolved and Texas has grown into other revenues to fund all of its transportation and healthcare and education, the things that states have to pay for, oil and gas hasn't always been the one thing that Texas used to fund its public schools. Funding public schools has been a long and complicated challenge, and I won't get into the debate of all that today either, because that's a long history and a long story that's lasted over 50 years, actually. So that's a complicated mess for another podcast. But it's important to note that Texas is unique in the way it has handled public education. Let me give you a couple examples. One, Texas did make an intentional investment in the teachers in the state through the teacher retirement system. The teacher retirement system is still to this day the largest public retirement system in the country. A lot of money that goes out to public school teachers with the intent was the idea that teachers don't make a lot of money. And even today, they kind of don't. So the trade-off would be that we take care of our teachers when they retire, so they would have a good investment that they can live off of when they decide to leave the industry. The exchange for that is, you probably didn't know this either, that if you're in the teacher retirement system, you don't qualify for Social Security. I happen to be one of those people. I worked as a kid from 16 to about 24 years old, and I have enough of those quarters to count for Social Security, but I actually can't draw that money because I'm in the teacher retirement system. And again, another weird and complicated thing. It's important to note, though, that Texas was just kind of moving along in its public education system for a long time until about 1983. And this is the case for a lot of states. But in 1983, during the Ronald Reagan administration, this report came out called A Nation at Risk. Now, I won't bore you with the details, but Nation at Risk came out, and it became sort of a game changer in reforming public schools throughout the country. Kind of what we found out was in that report that America's behind. Our schools are falling apart, infrastructure is not good, teachers aren't well trained, and the rest of the world is either caught up or taking the lead when it came to very important subject areas like reading, math, science. Now, this has been a common tale in public education for quite some time. In fact, I've often argued that the greatest investment in public education happened in the 1960s because of a little old satellite that Russia launched called Sputnik. When Russia launched Sputnik, America was suddenly behind the rest of the world in science. So the United States did what any good country would do in order to increase the knowledge base of a certain subject area. They invested. So suddenly in the 1960s, we have one of the largest investments in public education ever. We have the development of NASA, STEM programs, and out of that investment is birthed the computer age, space exploration, and tons of other great medical innovations that we're all benefiting from today. There are numerous examples. Investing in public education and doing it right actually yields some amazing results. But I digress. You go back to the Nation at Risk report that kind of basically said that we're not doing a great job. And from that, the state of Texas the following year in 1984 made some of the biggest reforms in state history. If you're a public school teacher now, I'm going to use a word you're comfortable with and you understand, the TEKS, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. Now, the TEKS are the standards by which we teach all students throughout the state. You have to have a set of standards, and the TEKS are the standards. We then build a curriculum off those standards, and then you go out and teach. That's called instruction. Did you know that Texas actually didn't have any kind of standards until 1984? Back then, they were called the essential elements. So from the essential elements, the TEKS were then later born and have been in existence ever since. And of course, they've changed and evolved over time. Also in 1984, we created the first set of teacher certification standards for the state. See, prior to that, you just get a degree and you go and teach. There was no certification standards. Now we have tons of certification offerings, and those have evolved over time too. It's also important to note that one thing that Texas has always done that sort of set an unintentional norm is the state guarantees and pays for all textbooks used in the schools. Now, they've done that for a long time. The school book depository building in Dallas, unfortunately, is where Lee Harvey Oswald actually shot JFK when he was going through Dallas, Texas. But it's buildings like that that were necessary to keep books, because the state of Texas guarantees the purchase of them so that all kids have textbooks to read. Well, that unintentional consequence of guaranteeing those books means that Texas sort of sets the standard for textbooks actually across the country, because Texas buys the books. The publishers know that that check's going to clear. So a lot of textbooks are actually written for Texas. And in fact, some of those Texas textbooks actually get sold to other states. That's a pretty powerful thing when you think about it. There are a lot of public school children in the state of Texas. Texas does a lot for public education. And they may not do all the best things, but they actually have a pretty large, huge standing in the rest of the country. Now, a lot of that comes with their population. Texas is number 2 in population. But like I said, there's a lot of public school kids in the state of Texas. A lot. So as you're going throughout this particular class, and you're learning about special populations and the way we kind of do things, I think it's important to know that a little bit of the history of the state of Texas and where public schools came from, so that you can get an idea that they've done a lot up to this point, but there's a lot more that could still be done. And I hope at some point we have the political will to do so. When I was a kid, I was fascinated with universities, colleges and universities. And I grew up in Waco, Texas. And Waco is the home of Baylor University. And I went to Baylor. I love Baylor, Cyclone Bears. My heart rests at that campus. It's a beautiful campus if you haven't been. But growing up in Waco, I kind of saw Baylor as this far-off thing way in the distance. I didn't really know and understand the power of colleges and universities and how they worked. And I always kind of felt that, growing up a poor kid in East Waco, colleges and universities were for rich people. And I didn't know, and I certainly wasn't rich. And my parents didn't go to college, so there was a lot I didn't know that I didn't know. But I was fascinated. I loved going to colleges and universities. I loved visiting them and seeing their giant buildings and big giant swaths of public spaces that kids just hung out in and studied and did whatever and played Frisbee, threw a football around. It just seemed attractive and fun to me. Even now, I'm 48 years old, and I have a 17-year-old who's about to go off to college, and our message for him has always been, you're going to go to college. It's important. You need university life. You need a college degree. We've always impressed that upon him. And so everywhere we've ever gone and traveled, we try to see a nearby college and university, whether we have any intent to go there or root for their football team or whatever. It doesn't matter. We just wanted to visit. So I've seen Harvard and Tulane and UCLA, Florida Atlantic, Florida State. I've seen all kinds of great universities across this country. I just love visiting them. Even now, as I sit in my office at Texas Women's University, and this is the first week of school for the fall semester, I just love being here. The atmosphere is so good. So many young and energetic students who are just ready to tackle a future that's frankly unknown to them. That's kind of the power of higher education. It does so much for a person's soul, their curiosity, being involved with other humans who are exactly on the same path that you are. asking questions, looking for answers, talking with experts who've been there, studied it, researched it, thought about it, and asked those philosophical questions about what is next. It's amazing when you ask the question, what is next? But higher education in the United States has kind of followed different patterns over the years. In the founding of Harvard way back in, 1636. So even the United States has a long history of higher education. But it really all starts back with the University of Bologna back in 1088. Universities as we know it now root back over 1,000 years. And it wasn't until I had a chance to visit Oxford University around 2018. I gave a talk there. I was part of a conference that went to Oxford. I spent 3 days. And Oxford's set up in a weird kind of way. You're a member of a college, and each college does its own thing, and it's a system that we're not used to in the United States. But those old buildings and neat libraries and giant dining halls were just fascinating to me. Giant towers, chapels, places of worship, because they have that. And then the rowing teams. I loved Oxford so much. Just an amazing place. But now, the United States has established itself as, obviously one of the most powerful countries in the world, and with that, a very intentional investment in public universities. And we can thank Thomas Jefferson for that, because as the thinker that he was, he drew up the plans and established the University of Virginia. Now, it wasn't the first public university. That would be William and Mary, but also in Virginia. Because universities in the United States way back in the 1700s, they weren't for everyone. And their focus was either legal or religious. Didn't have focus on business or education or nursing or any of the things that we have now. So it took powerful thinkers who had traveled a bit and seen at least European models of higher education to establish what we have here today. Public funded universities with the intent to do exactly the work that you're experiencing today. Now, as a professor, here's what I have to do. I have 3 chief jobs as a professor. One of them is teach, which is what I'm doing now, and I do it through a podcast. And I produce this podcast for anyone to listen to, but more importantly, specifically for you, my students. So I teach, and part of that teaching is being an expert in my field. My field is educational leadership. I tend to know a lot about educational leadership, and I impart that knowledge onto you. That's my job. So I teach. I write curriculum. And as a teacher, I'm also involved in my field. So I go to conferences related to educational leadership. I write papers related to educational leadership. I present at those conferences. I lend my knowledge in other areas. That's part of my teaching. The second thing I do is research. I'm a researcher, yes. So I go and I do studies, and I take the results of those studies and I write papers, and I then publish those papers. I also go off and get grants so I can do other research and look at other parts of education and understand our field a little bit more, because as a researcher and as an expert in my field, my job is to expand the body of knowledge so that the next people that come along have something else to start from. The last thing I'm expected to do is provide service. Service to not only my department and my college, and serving on committees and being part of the things that we're trying to do to grow our school and our college, but part of the university, helping and serving the university. Again, community, being part of community and committees and helping to grow what we have here at Texas Women's. But it also means serving on a national level, being a part of organizations. That's service. Those are the 3 main things that we do. Now, that work as a professor is very, very important. It's what establishes the reputation of the university. You could think right now, what's the best business school in the country? You could probably have an idea of what that might be. Or the best law school, the best school to be a vet, the best school to be a teacher. You probably have a pretty good idea of what that looks like. That's built upon a reputation that was established by faculty members who've done all of those things that I just described: their teaching, their research, and their service. And those are the three driving factors that create the functions of higher education institutions, particularly in the United States. There are over 4,000 higher education institutions in the United States, and they vary from four-year institutions to community colleges, two-year schools, private schools, public schools, trade and technical schools. There's a school for you out there if you're looking for it. Where the controversy is funding those schools, what the professors can do with those schools, and other things. You've probably seen in the news protests on campus due to the conflicts happening in Gaza, and how some of those college presidents handled it in a good or a bad way. And I won't get into my opinions on that. It's irrelevant. But one thing remains clear to me that higher education provides that needs to continue, and that is the curious discussion that we can have about a topic in order to grow each other's minds. That open dialogue is the essence of higher education. My job as a teacher and as a graduate professor is to make you think. It's also to make you feel a little uncomfortable from time to time. Uncomfortable in thinking about a topic in a different way that maybe you've never thought about before. Now, if you come away with the same opinion that you brought to the table, fine. I have no issue with that. But my job is to make you think differently than when you came in. That dialogue has to continue. When I was at Oxford, now, mind you, I'm not a big fan of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Sure, I've read the books and I've seen the movie, but I'm not like a nerdy Comic-Con fan when it comes to those books. But J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor at Oxford, and I had a chance to go to the pub where he sat on a regular basis as a professor, wrote his books, thought about those topics and those characters, and even, and this is crazy but true, would have public debate about certain topics with students over a glass of ale, sitting in a booth at a pub. And he would invite his students to come by and have that dialogue, have that discussion. And I assure you that the richest of growth in those students' education likely came from the pub and not from the classroom.